All right. I'm here today with Dr. Sharon Blackie, who is an award-winning writer and internationally recognized teacher whose work sits at the interface of psychology, mythology, and ecology. She's a writer, psychologist, and mythologist. And her highly acclaimed books, courses, and lectures and workshops are focused on the development of the mythic imagination and on the relevance of our native myths, fairy tales, and folk traditions to the personal, social, and environmental problems we face today. I'm so excited to have you here today. You've really inspired me in a lot of my work, and I know a lot of my peers as well feel the same. And I've got some great questions for you today from some of my friends on Instagram and others who work with me in our inner work process. So
thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. And by the way, just to say, I absolutely love your website and all of the resources on there. It's a very, very, very fine thing.
Thank you. That means so much to me. So again, great to have you. I've been waiting to do this interview for a while, and one of the ones I'm most excited to do, and to bring you here all the way from Scotland. Very exciting.
Wait, it's actually Wales. I'm sorry to break a bubble. I move around quite a lot, it seems, but I'm actually in Wales these days. So it's a little bit further south, but it's still very Celtic. So we have the same kind of stories.
Well, I have a Celtic background as well, so it has meant so much to read your process. And also get to know you know how much you have moved around in your writing, because you definitely write about that. All right, so let's get started. I have a few interesting questions here, and I'm sure we'll kind of go our own route if we're able to. So to start, something that came up for me in reading If Women Rose Rooted was what you brought up about Joseph Campbell and Maureen Murdoch, and the heroine's journey by Murdoch was a big influence for me, in contrast to Campbell, because I think a lot of people who first get into this type of work get into Campbell, and we see that right now actually getting very popular again. And I think it was really important for me to read your words, just say it very clearly about how Murdoch encountered Campbell and what he said about women in their journey. So I'm curious, you know, coming from Pacifica, where they house his work and teach his work, you know, can you tell us a little bit more about how it inspired your research, you know, what she had to say and her encounter with him?
Yeah, well, first of all, I should make it clear that I have a great deal of respect for Campbell and what he did. And in whatever I say about him, I wouldn't like whatever I say to be taken as a criticism, because the most important thing here is he was very much a man of his time. So he wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Well, it was published in 1949, so he's probably writing it for a fairly, you know, good couple of years before that, at least. And those were heroic times, particularly in America. You know, it was a society that still is very much focused on individualism and the heroic, but back then it was profound, particularly having come out of the Second World War period where heroism was rife. And so he brought his own lens inevitably to his analysis of that work. So that happened, and it's supposed to happen. It's what we all do. So I have no criticism of Campbell, but today, you know, we live in a very, very different world, and the world is we clearly were in the midst of an environmental crisis, and the problems that women have faced over the centuries has become very much more clear to us all. So I suppose when I first came across Campbell, I rejected his idea of the hero's journey just on pure instinct, because it did not reflect my experience. And it was only kind of like later that I started to think about the whole kind of concept of cultural mythology and where it fits in. So when I came across Maureen Murdoch's work, which I don't think I did until my mid-30s, probably mid-late 30s, I can't remember exactly when, she seemed very much more to be expressing the kind of experience that I had had as a woman, that yes, my problem, and I wrote about this in If Women Rose Rooted, had been a divorce from the feminine in myself. You know, it was just, I didn't know what a woman was supposed to be in this world, which is very much a man's world. I had been the classic child of the patriarchy who sought originally to make my way by imitating the masculine. And Murdoch kind of put a hole in that and said, no, this is not really what women are supposed to do. So that was quite a revelation to me that late in my life. And it really started me thinking about what the female journey was. Now, I suspect that Murdoch's journey too probably is a little bit outdated now for the generations that are growing up that are very much younger than I am. I'm kind of 60 in 6 months' time, so I'm getting on a bit now. But, I don't know that a 20-year-old or today would be embarking on Murdoch's journey, because it's very much about reconciling with the mother and so on. And I think there are different issues that people are facing. So I think we revise our sense of the hero's journey or the heroine's journey according to the world that we are living in and the issues that we're facing, and we're supposed to. And I guess what I've done in my own work is focus on a concept that I call the post-heroic journey, which is very much relevant to men and to women, which is what are we looking at? If we look beyond the individualistic, if we look beyond the heroic, if we look to a journey which takes us back to a sense of community with other humans around the world rather than ourselves kind of as predominant, and that embeds us back into the land that we live on, that's the journey for today.
Absolutely. I love to hear that in just spoken, post-heroic. I think that is really speaks to where we feel we are at right now. And I would agree that Murdoch's work is so important, but also there are elements to it that we are as well kind of moving through and moving past and maybe down back into the earth.
Exactly. I think she had a journey for the feminist movement, if you like, when women were starting to take their voices back. And I'm not in any way suggesting that we've got our voices back, because there are constant forces trying to undermine it. But we have a new issue now, which is the environmental issue, and the old stories in our native traditions which tell us that women are very much bound up with that particular process. So yeah, the hero's journey, the heroine's journey, I think it's become broader than that. It's kind of the post-heroic journey, or as I put it in If Women Rose Rooted, the eco-heroine's journey, if you want to call it that, where we are really looking to embed ourselves back in the land, in our places, and take responsibility for what we do with and to the planet.
Yeah, and I love that part of If Women Rose Rooted, and considering it made me think about, different people that I have interacted with that really want to kind of even separate from the idea of Mother Earth. But if we go back to the old stories and look at how it was written, that we can see how it has evolved as that type of a symbol, and that it's really hard to divorce it before we reclaim that voice and return to it.
Indeed. And I think if you look back at the old stories, what's very interesting is certainly in my traditions of these lands of Britain and Ireland, they are post-heroic already. The Grail mythology, which I dispute most of what Campbell said about the Grail mythology, but that's been my area of study, and from a native person's perspective. It wasn't a hero's journey. It was a post-heroic journey. It was about asking the compassionate question, what ails thee, to the wounded fisher king. It was about respecting the women who were the bearers of the Grail. The Grail itself in Celtic mythology was very clearly a symbol of what we call sovereignty, which is the relationship with the land and the other world. So this is already post-heroic. It wasn't about his individuality. They never won the Grail quest by slaying dragons or winning battles. They won the Grail quest and became the Grail hero by asking the compassionate question, respecting the feminine, growing into some kind of, broader sense of self. So they're already post-heroic. We just have to rediscover them, I think, in that way.
That's amazing. That's amazing to hear that. And, it's funny how that gets lost, or rather more enraging.
Yes, enraging. Rage is good sometimes, yeah.
Yes, and my clients know that I definitely empower that. So I'm really curious, in reading your work and listening to your podcast, The Mythic Life, it seems that Jung's work is really present. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey with Jungian psychology?
Yeah, it was a curious one, because I went and did a psychology degree at the age of 18. I went into psychology with an all arts background. My school training was all in literature and that kind of stuff. I had very little science, but I happened to choose a university almost by mistake that was very, not even scientific, but scientistic. in its approach and very behaviorist. Um, and so Jung was a footnote to Freud, and Freud was frowned upon because it was all a bit weird. And they loved Boris Skinner and behaviorism. And so I learned to know Jung. I hated Freud, always have done. I do not love Freud. I'll just make that very clear. And so it was very late in my life, and when I'd gone through what I call my wasteland years, where I'd gone into a corporate environment, and I came back to Britain and wanted to retrain in psychology, that I had really been during those years just rediscovering Jung. So he was a late discovery for me, if you like, but by the time I got to this age, 35, 40, I really was listening to what he was saying, particularly about individuation and the importance of the second half of life. But I suppose I have a bit of a beef with a lot of Jungian thought, which I'll express, and again, very gently. What I love about Jung is that he was an apprentice all his life. And I have a big thing about apprenticeship and the importance of apprenticeship. Jung never thought he knew it all. He never thought he'd arrived. He was always learning, and he was a scholar right to the absolute end. And he took pleasure and pride in changing his opinions and saying, yeah, well, I thought that 20 years ago, I don't now. And to me, that's just the most wonderful thing, you know, about the man. It's such a rare, and he had his flaws clearly, but it's such a rare thing. So I really respect him for that. What I do not relate to, I suppose, is what I would call early Jung or traditional Jung, which is to see everything out there as an aspect of the human psyche. That's so human-centric, you know. And when Jung got older and started to think about synchronicity and came into contact with people like Wolfgang Pauli, and began to conceive that actually, no, psyche is outside of us, not kind of just inside of us, and the you know, the statement that we think that psyche is in us, but we're actually in psyche. When he starts instead to see these archetypal energies as having an independent existence of us, stories as having an independent existence of us, and if we're lucky, they happen to us, that's when I start to love Jung. And I have a great deal of admiration, particularly for James Hillman, who followed that late Jungian tradition. So when, for example, I work with fairy tales, which I do a lot, and I come across the classic traditional Jungian interpretation that all of these characters, all of these images, all of these motifs are aspects of our own psyche, I really want to scream, because that's not very interesting. You know, what's much more interesting is the idea that they have an independent existence, that there are other elements of other energies in the world. And for heaven's sake, there are other energies in the world other than human. So yeah, I really, really respect Jung for that ability to shift his worldview and never, ever, ever to stop being an apprentice to the great work.
I love that about him as well. And I love your perspective on that and the journey you took through the beginnings and to the post-Jungian aspects of the work, and looking at really how he was able to say, no, I don't believe that anymore. Or in post-Jungian tradition, we often say, oh, you know, Jung would probably, you know, accept this, or he would like this critique. And that really fosters, you know, the work further. It's, you know, seeing it get really popular lately out there, and you see really the traditional classical, you know, almost kind of really antiquated aspects of Jung's work that he would definitely not necessarily agree with. And we see that in the Black Books, that he really shifts over to soul and to the feminine in a different way than he did before. So I would definitely agree with that. Also brought in a little bit more perspective for me on considering, you know, psyche out there and psyche within. And we do often say, like, the elements even in dream work, you know, all these parts of the dream are part of you, or all these parts of the fairy tale are a part of you, in a certain way. And you're shaking your head, and I really appreciate that reconsideration, to think of them more as numinous and autonomous. And I think I'll ask you a question in a bit about something that relates to that for me.
And just to add on that, if I may take a little bit more time on it, because it's so interesting, is that, you know, back the most ancient, which Jung knew very well, the most ancient European philosophy in the Greek tradition had exactly this same idea. Plato's ideas, which were the basis for Jung's archetypes, were all founded on these energies existing independently of humans. In the Sufi tradition, we have the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, which is kind of similar and not exactly the same, but similar to the Greek concept of the anima mundi, the world soul. We have the idea that this is a world that contains these creatures, the beings that we might think of as gods, the archetypal energies, the stories, all of which have an independent existence and which, if we're lucky, happen to us. So, the idea that this is all about humans is a very recent thing in human history and in human thought. And it's really, really nice also to see that beginning to come back as well today.
Yeah, I think sometimes in our scientism, we can get really wrapped up in subjectivity, objectivity, and all the like, and really get lost in the experiential aspect or the phenomenological aspect of what that is.
Sure.
So your work also, like we've been talking about a little bit, focuses heavily on ecology and returning to the environment, returning to the sacred earth and rooting down in the feminine. Many of the stories from your Celtic background resemble these values, while also redeeming aspects of feminine wisdom that have been lost for the Western woman. I'm curious about this process for you as a writer and a storyteller. What was it like to encounter these stories?
Well, I've been encountering those stories ever since I was a child because, that's my background. I'm a bit of a Celtic mongrel. My father's family is entirely Scottish. My mother's family is part Irish and part from the old north, the old Brittonic north, the north of England. My stepfather is Welsh and my husband is Welsh. So, I have all of these influences and have been reading these stories ever since I was a child, but they were presented to me as entertainment. They're presented as fairy tales, which were entertainment. And I think a big revelation that I had when I really started to think about this again in my process of my descent, I suppose, to the underworld, when I was trying to get myself out of the wasteland, was to suddenly understand that actually, no, it was a big revelation. It shouldn't have been that. No, once upon a time, these weren't entertainment. This was a worldview. This was cosmology. This was mythology. It was, and that was a real, nobody thinks of it like that in this part of the world. These are just stories. Our religion is Christianity, and the fact that it came from a different continent and came to us quite late is kind of brushed over. That was our native worldview. And when I realized that, I suddenly began to find much more of an interest and to delve into them in a major way to say, okay, what did our ancestors think? And I think it is so important that we embrace that aspect of these stories, because otherwise in the West, we feel disempowered. We feel that we have no power at all in the face of the world's crises. And we look to wisdom from other peoples, from other indigenous peoples. And their wisdom is very beautiful. Native American wisdom is wonderful. So is Buddhist wisdom and from the East, but it's not ours, and it doesn't belong to our land. And I always feared that if we didn't embrace the wisdom that was part of our own lineage, that we kind of wouldn't feel responsible, for the land and for what we were doing to it. And I think, and also we wouldn't feel inspired because they're not our stories. And so the idea that these stories are full, for me as a woman who grew up in an era where women didn't have much of a voice, to find powerful women of consequence, very serious women who you really don't want to mess with, and to find them as guardians and protectors of the land. It's just like, what a gift. And this isn't made up. You can see this thread very clearly. It's an established thread in the oldest Celtic literature and folklore. So that was just kind of what I'd been, although I knew the stories, all of a sudden it's kind of an epiphany. You're seeing them in a completely different light and understand why they matter. And at that moment, it was just very clear to me that I had to do the work that I've been doing and trying to encourage people to encounter those stories in that way.
Yeah. What was the hardest part about that for you?
I guess getting over the idea that, or getting over the idea that it wasn't just entertainment, because the Christian worldview, I think, is so entrenched in our cultural mythology. even if I didn't grow up in a particularly Christian background, you know, it's very different over here from the way it is in America, where it would be much more common to grow up actually actively going to church. Very rare here, even when I was a child. But nevertheless, it pervaded everything. And God, as the great man in the sky, pervaded everything. And it's still a word that I can't hear or use without a bit of a frisson of kind of like, you know, oh my goodness, this is transgressive, because I don't like that image. And so to come to terms with the idea that women once were divine, wow. And not only were divine, but actually, particularly in Irish and Celtic mythology, they were the ones that really mattered. You know, they were the ones that carried the moral and spiritual authority of the other world. It is an intensely female-centric mythology. There's no dispute about that I've ever heard by any serious scholar, man or woman. And so just coming to terms with that and thinking, well, what does that mean? Because I wasn't a great fan of the feminine. I hadn't had a great relationship with my own mother. I'd had no good feminine role models to grow up with, and learning to love the feminine again and to respect the feminine in that context was probably the hardest part of it for me, just to accept that that could be.
Mhm. Yeah, and for me, that brings up, you know, in reading the stories that you present in If Women Was Rooted, really how violent they are and how, you know, devastating and sad they are in regards to how you know, the treatment of the feminine, and
Yeah.
reclaiming that, having to go back and take the entertainment or the bits that have been taken out and reclaim them. And how that impacted me, it was immense, and still is. I ended up creating a presentation based off of all this that you've been talking about right here, because of you actually, with the Celtic stories, and talking about how what happened when Christianity came in from the Romans, and thinking about Ulrika and how she fought for the land.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing to encounter and to live with, you know, that whole just millennia of repression of the female. But I think I think you have to go there, and you have to allow yourself all of the emotions, whether it's grief or rage. And I think we have to have both, you know. Well, there was an interesting thing in If Women Are Rooted where I interviewed Cilla Elworthy, who was an older woman at the time, and she talked about the difference between what she saw, the difference between rage and wrath. And wrath to her was kind of like a righteous form of anger, which was filled with a yearning for justice. And I like that. And I worry today that particularly in some aspects of spirituality, you know, putting all the other more kind of intellectual stuff aside, that we have such a focus on love and light and forgiving everybody for anything, just kind of as a matter of principle. We don't let ourselves feel that emotion. We don't see that there is sometimes a need for consequences, and that you know, that change often doesn't come without consequences. It's just human nature. It's unfortunate, but it is. And what I love about the Celtic stories is they have consequences. You know, if you really make the goddess of the land mad, she's going to turn your land into a wasteland. That's good, because then you learn. And we haven't learned. And I worry that we won't, you know, we'll continue not to learn if we just let everything pass by and we try and love people like Donald Trump into submission. It's just like, that's not going to go very well. It hasn't gone very well, has it? So we have to not be vengeful and kind of like, you know, create wars, but we have to create consequences and to make people understand that if you kill the planet will die, for example.
Mhm. Yes, and the theme of the wasteland and the wasteland king. I mean, that pattern repeating, and you know, us dealing with that over here in the States has been just tremendous. And thinking about the reaction has gotten even more about love and light. It's so ironic. How do we deal with that? And you know, people trying to love it out. It
I
doesn't
know
work.
it doesn't work, and that's a really interesting balance, I think, that women particularly struggle with, because the opposite doesn't work either. You know, just destroying and trying to wipe out, and that that balance between understanding what has gone wrong, kind of engaging with the community, um, engaging with the community, with the other world, not just the human community and the people around you and the land around you, is so much a part of these stories. And it seems to me that in many ways, it's kind of a manifesto for what we need to do again, for what we need to learn to do again. There's so much is tied up in those old stories if we just treat them with the respect that I've always thought they deserve.
Yes. Well, and many of the stories are very visceral, like I've said before, and speak of a lot of loss of power and the rape and discarding of the feminine, which I know we all feel very deeply on a primordial level. But this can also be amplified on the bigger collective level, which we've been talking about. And your work has been a big inspiration for my dissertation on the rape of the world soul. And I'm very curious about your understanding of the dark crone that often shows up in these stories as a kind of medial woman. And kind of like exactly what you were just talking about, how we need these figures that represent these consequences, not only for the feminine, but for the collective as a whole. Thinking of the Kaliak and what she represents. And sometimes these dark kind of fairy godmother images. She's carried a lot for me in my journey. And like you were saying, sometimes think these images just happen to us and they aren't us. And we can't identify with them, but they just show up for some particular reason. Can you tell me how her presence has impacted your work, both professionally and personally?
Yeah, I'd say she is me. I own that, absolutely. When I was a very small child, I never wanted to be the princesses in the fairy stories. I wanted to be the old woman in the woods that you didn't mess with. Again, not in a nasty way, but just because that just felt necessary to me. And what I love about these characters is that they cut through all the bullshit. They will not have you speak anything other than the truth. They won't have the fake news. They won't have the love and light when it's not real, when it's put on, and they require the truth. If you look at, again, if you look at the Grail legends, the character of the Loathly Lady, so say Kundry and Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, or any of the other Loathly ladies who come out of the woods and they lay into the Grail hero and tell him all of the ways in which he's absolutely failed, in which he's so self-important and he needs to get off his backside and go off and actually do something, rather than play around with swords and men. That truth-telling aspect is so important, and I really respect that. And I grew up in the north of England, where actually, we're blunter perhaps than lots of other places around the world. Not always in a cruel way, but just kind of tell it like it is. So I always respected that about those women. And whether you're looking at the Cailleach in Gaelic mythology, or Baba Yaga, or my favorite fictional character in the world, Terry Pratchett's Granny Weatherwax, you're looking at these women who will not take bullshit. They want you to stand up and be counted. They want you to recognize the world for what it is and not some kind of la 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 version of what you would like it to be. And I love that. So a lot of people think of that as dark. I suppose I've never thought of it as dark. I do like consequences, and I think consequences are necessary, so I don't see that as dark. I like the idea that there are old women who you don't want to mess with, because you shouldn't. You should respect something that is of that nature, that is truth telling, that stands for values that are very, very necessary. So I guess I'm a great lover of Baba Yaga, particularly. I know she's not in the Celtic tradition, so I'm kind of stepping out, but very much in the European tradition, the Eastern European tradition, where you never quite know what you're going to get, and what you get depends on how you come, how you approach her, and what you bring. You might walk away carrying the fire, as Vasilisa does in the most famous Baba Yaga story, or you might get, baked in her oven and eaten for breakfast, and it depends on whether you fail the test. That's good. We need to be tested. So all of these aspects of the crone, and the Cailleach particularly, who's very much in my native lands, who stands against the predations of humans, who will not let the hunter take too many deer, particularly in the season where they're going to be pregnant and he's taking female deer. That kind of, no, you may not. You may go no further. That as an image of an elder woman, I think, is sadly lacking from our culture, and I see it as intensely inspiring. Someone to stand up and say, no, there's so little of that. there's a lot of yes, and a lot of yeses, and oh, I'll approach you and I'll try, if you want that, then yes, let's try and make it work. And there's very little, no, this is wrong. And some things we just know in our guts are wrong, and these old women know that it's wrong and they're not afraid to say it. And I think that's what it means to me. That image I find incredibly inspiring.
Yes. I have so many words for that. It's hard to find them right now. I remember reading, I think it was a blog post that you did on the return of the Kaliak, and just the imagery that was used, and how that really, for me, really rung true, especially for how we're feeling on a collective level. Like we're feeling this archetype return, this return of the feminine, but it's a return of this type of feminine wisdom. And a lot of people talking about the different things about COVID that she represents, that we've had to stay home and we've had to kind of recuperate. We've had to stop, come out of the system in a certain way. And there's a particular darkness to that, though, or a particular kind of like saying no and stopping, and there's consequences that have definitely occurred. And thinking of that archetype as her has been very interesting. But even before that, she was this feeling of her returning. I equate her also to Hecate in the Greek pantheon, and her as like the guide and protectress of women like Persephone.
Yeah, they have, and Hecate originally was not a crone. Of course, it was only later that she was made into a crone. But nevertheless, she was very much the kind of medial woman tradition, and I would see her kind of as kind of, I don't know, menopausal-ish maybe. But I agree with you that that these are initiators. Their role. They have many archetypal characteristics, don't they? But one of their major archetypal roles is as the initiator. They are the ones who test you, and who are the agents of your transformation, if you'll allow that to happen. And the other thing they are, and which I agree with you is particularly relevant to these times, is they are tricksters too. Tricksters in the sense not of jokers, but of disruptors. They break stuff that needs to be broken so that new stuff can come to life. These old women, and
Yeah.
I love, again, we need trickster for all
Yes.
tricksters.
And and a trickster that's different than the masculine trickster. I think it's always important to consider her that she really demands a kind of integrity, and her tricks are, have a sense of nurturance to them, but they're still that kind of ambivalence that is healthy and helpful.
Absolutely, good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah, another theme in your writing, like we've talked about, is the losing the feminine voice, or regaining that feminine voice, and getting rerouted in these stories, as a sense of self. Finding that wellspring again in the earth. What advice do you have for women who might be struggling deeply with this process, or who have been on it but that feel at a crossroads? And the transitions that are occurring in today's world, like we've talked about, a lot of people who get stuck in the love and light, or even just on the Jungian journey too as well. Thinking of the struggle it is to cope with the system, like you spoke about, once being in the academic arena and having to come out of it.
I think, to me, the thing that I find a bit distressing with so many people, particularly younger people these days, is that sense that still, no matter how kind of enlightened they might think they are, how much they think they have gleaned, there is still an attachment to the cultural mythology that says you must have it all now, in a weekend, finished by the time you're 25, have arrived as a great guru by the time you're 30, and then I don't know what else you're supposed to do with the rest of your life. And so again, I come back to Jung, that whole concept of life as a journey, of life as an apprenticeship. It's supposed to be difficult, and it's going to be difficult again and again and again, because nobody ever goes through one transition period and one period of darkness. We're supposed to do this again and again and again, so that right up until the time when we take our last breath, we continue to grow and we continue to transform. And that whole ancient concept, which James Hillman wrote so beautifully about, of calling, the sense that we each come here to this world with a particular gift to express, with a particular, I'm going to call it purpose, but I don't mean it to sound as directive as perhaps purpose does. That is also a journey. You're not supposed to have got there when you're 30 and consider yourself a failure if you're not. It's so I think a lot of it is a when people go into the underworld, when they reach these transition points, there is often a feeling, and I had it myself, so I speak from experience, that everything you've done up until then is wrong, was wrong. You know, that was a mistake, that was the wrong path. And from my own experience, it took me an awfully long period of time, I mean, literally years, to accept that what I had seen as my digression from the one true path, you know, into a corporate environment that I did not respond to, that was not doing good work, frankly, at all, that actually made me more powerful or more able to communicate because I'd seen the dark side. You know, I'd been in there, I'd done it, I'd seen it, I'd experienced it. And if I hadn't done that, I possibly wouldn't have been able to do the work that I'm doing today. Now, that's absolutely not to excuse it because I self-flagellated for years about this. You know, it's just kind of it's a slow dawning realization. So I think to me the main things are, first of all, to recognize that it's supposed to be this way. You know, we're supposed to have these big transformations and initiatory periods. So we're not doing it wrong if we do, but also that we're kind of supposed, in a sense, to make what we think of as mistakes in order to learn from them. And if we arrived in this world fully formed, what would be the point? You know, again, according to the old philosophers. So I think it's just a trust in the process would be my advice, and to stay with it and to just let it happen, because when it does, it's incredibly beautiful. It's hard, but it's incredibly beautiful. And the richnesses that unfold from it are, you know, the biggest riches in the world.
Wow, very powerful to hear you reflect that. And I know a lot of my friends over on Instagram will appreciate your words. And me thinking about even my personal process and the crossroads that I find myself at routinely, really just trusting in that process. And, you know, we don't need to follow a certain code or system. And I think when I, in my past journey, stepped out of it, that's when things started to flow.
Yeah, it's about courage, isn't it? I think it really it's about courage, um, to take the step off the path while you're blindfolded and you don't know where your foot's going to land. And that's a hard thing to find. You know, I didn't find it till I was in my late 30s. So I understand as much as anybody. But boy, when you do, then that's when the magic really starts to happen.
Yes. So I'm also interested in kind of, you know, what's the work that you're doing right now? I know you have a group starting in December. Is that true?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I'm my next book. I'm my next book, because of an intense relocation and health issue and a really weird year with COVID, has been postponed a little bit. But my next book is going to be about myths and stories of elderhood in females and in women. So that's kind of picking up a bit where If Women Rose Rooted left off, and really exploring this archetype of the crone and the dark crone and all of these older women in our mythologies that provide perhaps inspiration that we don't really have necessarily in real life, many of us. So that hopefully will be completed in the beginning, but in the middle of next year, and be published early in 2022. I am, for next year, my teaching work, which is the other side that kind of complements my writing, and which is a constant balancing act, you know, what I do most of. I have something called the Bone Cave, which I think of as kind of like a virtual fire pit for the exploration of stories and the exploration of deep issues, which I'm doing on Zoom once a month, one Saturday afternoon a month. It's called the Bone Cave, and it's about breaking the bones of stories or archetypal beings or particular ideas. So the first one is about for example, the old Celtic deity Bridget, and the return of the light. And she is associated with many different archetypes. The smith, which is one of my favorite archetypes, very magical archetype, much more interesting than the hero, and the poet, and associated with fire and forges and alchemy. So we'll be exploring that whole idea, for example. So that I'm quite excited about that, because I've over the course of the past year, I've become quite attached to the Zoom format. You know, I like to see people in person as well, but I've become a lot more comfortable with it. And it's interesting how much intimacy can happen
Yeah.
in those settings over Zoom, isn't it? It's kind of like, you know, maybe we've all grown into it in a way. So those are the two main things, and I think that's going to keep me busy probably for the next year. Both of my passions, the writing and the exploration of stories in groups, in that kind of deep work.
Well, so exciting. And I love to hear that positive reception of Zoom because I feel the same way. There's some setbacks to having to do it, but we've, been able to cross borders and meet people and chat and create greater groups. And it's definitely been a great discovery. And I would encourage my friends at Instagram to leap over to your bone cave. That sounds really, really exciting. Other books that Dr. Blackie has written are The Enchanted Life and Foxfire Wolfskin, about shape-shifting women, which I particularly love that one as well. I'm reading it right now. Um, okay, well, it was really, really great. What a treasure to have you and be able to have this conversation with you. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure my friends as well will love to listen.
And thank you. It's been lovely to experience the very deep and thoughtful questions. That doesn't always happen. So thank you.